Well, thank you to the previous speakers, Senator Seitz and Representative Rand, for the warm welcome and for giving the background for this project. It's because of the leadership in the state that we are here, and we're pleased to do so. Also, Justice Stratton and the other members of the judiciary, and obviously Director Moore, former Director Collins, and the members of the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections for opening all of your staff up, your data, research expertise, and advice throughout this process. We greatly appreciate it. And I also want to thank everyone here. We've talked to many of you 1, 2, 3 times over the course of the last 6 or 7 months as we've sought to learn more about the system here in Ohio, which is truly unique when we look at criminal justice systems across the country. And it's because of your advice and insights and helping us see what we couldn't see in the data that we feel confident about the presentation and the report in front of you. I want to apologize in advance for not having what we'd prefer and what we've been doing over the last 6 months, which is really just to have an open question and answer time when we can really have a back and forth about the findings in the report. We hope to be doing that this afternoon in the stakeholder panels. There's some cards in front of you to fill out if you have questions you'd like those panels to be sure to address. We also look forward to talking with you over the next several weeks as we want to get your reactions, feedback to this report, and then move into the policy development process. I think most of you know a little bit about the Justice Center. We're a national nonpartisan membership association working with all 3 branches of state government. Just to review the justice reinvestment process here in Ohio, we're in phase 1, which is the analysis phase. But following that, assuming policies are enacted as a result of this work, we'll then continue working in the state and with the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections and other agencies to implement those policies and practices. And then finally, we want to make sure there's mechanisms that allow for policymakers to hold the system accountable, to track the impact of these new policies and practices going forward in real time. As part of the first phase, however, we've been collecting reams of data from all parts of the system. And I want to recognize Mike Eisenberg, who is the research expert who's been doing all the hard data analysis for us out of the Texas office. We've engaged input from many of you through the last 6, 7 months, various retreats and meetings and different association gatherings that you've invited us to. Welcome. And we've appreciated hearing from you in all those venues. And so here we are today to announce and release the findings, the summary of the findings, really, based on our comprehensive analysis of the state's system. The next step, as you've heard, is from this analysis to then, over the next 4 to 5 months, develop a policy framework that will address the challenges we're going to highlight today. So quickly, I'm going to give you a brief review of the report that's in front of you. You can read the details, obviously, during today or later. Second, focus on the key findings. And then third, just introduce how the presentations you hear from Dr. Latessa, Dr. Fabello, and Dr. Osher later today will connect back to the report. But first, bottom line key findings. We have analyzed reams of data. We have produced, I think, 300 PowerPoint slides that we've made the working group suffer through, and even other presentations that many of you have seen in various focus groups over this time period. Our job now is to boil it all down, to synthesize it into the 3 key points that we see coming out of this analysis. The first is that you have a very costly revolving door at the front end of your prison system for nonviolent property and drug offenders. More than 10,000 felony level 4 and 5, the lowest level felony offenders in your system, are coming into prison each year. We're looking at 2008 data here. They stay about 9 months, which is not enough time, the director will tell you, to really get them into any kind of programming or treatment before they are released again, because that's how long they received as a sentence. And then 3/4 of them are released without any supervision back in the community. The second point is that the alternatives you set up to divert people from prison have no clear, agreed-upon, shared consensus about the criteria for who should go into which alternative. Ohio is very unique, and you should be proud of the types of alternatives and community corrections programs you've developed, which is unlike anywhere else in the country. And the state has supported those local innovations with significant resources that have increased over the years. But there's no clear criteria to inform a judicial decision or a decision in the courtroom about the selection of program participants for those programs that will ensure the most cost-effective utilization of those state-funded resources. And that finally, underlying both of these issues is the reality that most offenders in Ohio's criminal justice system are on probation. In fact, there's about 250,000 people, nearly 3% of all adults in Ohio, are on probation supervision. That's as much as we can tell you, because there's no data beyond that estimate conducted by a survey of the Bureau of Justice Statistics to tell you which counties, which felony levels, how well they're doing, how many were revoked. But we can tell you there's about 250,000 of them. And they're supervised by about 187 different agencies operating at the municipal, county, and state levels of government. Sometimes they're supervised by multiple agencies. The policies of those agencies differ dramatically, use different risk assessments, have different training standards, supervise offenders differently, and as a result have different levels of effectiveness. So those are our key findings. Quickly to skim through the report and the kind of top line points from each part of the section of the report. First, in terms of crime rates, crime has been fairly stable or declined since 2000. Your violent crime rate has been largely flat. It's gone up or down a little bit here or there from year to year, but it's still significantly below the national average violent crime rate. Your property crime rate has actually fallen about 8% since 2000, but it's actually above the national average, surprisingly. Despite that flat or lowered crime rate, it's surprising to see that prison population, the number of people coming into prison each year, your intake, has gone up 41% since 2000. It's gone down in the last couple years, which is a good trend, but still, since 2000, you're 41% higher in terms of the number coming into prison each year. The number of people on probation has also increased, 34% since 2000. So more people are going to prison, more people are going on to probation. And you have, again, about 3% of the adult population now on probation, the highest percentage of anywhere in the region. And the increase in probation population here in Ohio far exceeds anywhere else of your neighboring states. In terms of your community corrections programs, you provided significant state funding. You provided $117 million back in fiscal year 2006. That's gone up to $137 million in fiscal year 2010. And thanks to the work of Dr. Latessa, and which he'll talk about in more detail, we have some outcome data, probably the best evaluation data of community corrections programs anywhere. The unfortunate news is, the good news, let me start with the good news, is that when these programs focus on high-risk offenders, you can dramatically reduce their rates of new felony convictions, of any new convictions, and even the chance they're going to be reincarcerated. The bad news is that when you focus on low and medium-risk folks, they get worse. And the problem is, because you have no clear criteria, a lot of low and medium-risk folks are going into these programs, which means that overall, while these programs could work if they just focused on high-risk offenders, overall, these programs are increasing crime rates, increasing recidivism rates across the board by any measure. This is not making a cost-effective utilization of these resources. And when we look at who's coming into prison, the vast majority of people coming into prison are still lower-level F4 and F5 offenders. When you look at just the prison population over the last 5 years, from 2004 to 2009, the prison population's increased 15%, exacerbating the overcrowding, now at 133%, which you heard. And so when we look at the breakdown of the admissions to prison and compare 2003 to 2008, we see 3 drivers. First, the biggest increase in admissions is from your felony level 3 level offenders. They went up 53% during this time period. The second is felony level 2 and felony level 4, both going up about 20%. Admissions are clearly the driver. Another driver that doesn't look so big until you start doing the math is the increase in the average length of stay. It's only about 2 months more than it was back in 2003, but when you take 2 months and multiply it by 26,000 offenders, it means you need 4,000 more beds for them to serve the additional 2 months. It adds up. But again, overall, 56% of your admissions are still F4 and F5 offenders. And so the change in F4 and F5 admissions from year to year is still going to have the biggest short-term and medium-term impact on your prison population from year to year. Finally, in terms of post-release supervision, currently what we see is that supervision resources aren't being targeted towards the people for whom those resources could have the biggest impact on crime. They're not focused on the high-risk offenders. So let me show you, this is a breakdown of the people released from prison in 2008. We've grouped them by their risk level. So the size of the box represents the size of the population. Most of the folks coming out of prison, you can see, are low or medium risk to return to prison. And then a very small percentage are high or very high risk to public safety. Bottom line, the high-risk group, that orange box, is twice as likely to come back to prison as the green box is. But what percent of each box do you supervise? coming out of prison, about half of both the high-risk offenders get supervision and half of the low-risk offenders get supervision. You got enough supervision resources, but they're not targeted at the highest risk offenders for whom they could have the biggest impact in terms of reducing recidivism. So let me go back to the three kind of key findings. This revolving door at the front end for F4 and F5 level offenders, this lack of criteria to make the best use and utilization of your well-funded community corrections resources, and then this patchwork of probation supervision. We'll take these one by one. First, in terms of this revolving door, we've analyzed prison admissions in 2008, broke them down by felony level. As we said before, 56% of people coming into prison were F4 or F5 offenders. We broke those F4 and F5 offenders down by offense type to look at what type of offenses they're committing. We took burglaries and set them aside because it's a pretty serious property offense. We didn't want to include those when we talk about lower level property and drug offenses. But even still, we had over 10,000 admissions in 2008 that were property and drug offenders, not including burglary. They stayed about 9 months. They cost taxpayers about $189 million that year. And 72% of them were released without any supervision. Which raises a question about these lower level F4 and F5 offenders. What's the best sentencing option for them? What's going to be tough? It's important to be smart on crime. We also still want to be tough on crime. And which is going to reduce recidivism? Option A is to send them to prison for 9 months and release them without any supervision. Or we could consider option B, which is what we see in most states, and where probably still most offenders go in Ohio, which is to put them on to 1, 2, or 3 years of probation, require them to complete drug treatment, provided it's available. Dr. Osher is going to talk about the dilemma there. Require them to be drug tested randomly, require them to report and hold them accountable with a set of graduated sanctions through effective probation, which Dr. Fabella is going to talk about. Which of these is a tougher sanction? The second point is there's no clear criteria. As in most states, you have felony offenders being either sentenced to probation or to prison, and often jail is used as a condition of probation to make that probation system have some more teeth. In Ohio, you have added a number of options in between jail and probation and prison. And you've invested significant resources in those. But how a judge decide whether someone they were going to send to probation or to prison should go into one of these programs and by what criteria, it probably exists for each judge in terms of how they think about using these resources, but it doesn't exist in a shared, agreed-upon criteria for the state to ensure that these programs are being used in the most cost-effective way. Let me show this another way. If you show the 5 felony levels, you got felony level 1, where you've got aggravated robbery and other most serious offenses, and you've got felony level 5s on the right, where you have drug abuse and other small property crime. If you think about where most states are at, they want to prioritize resources, and this is how your sentencing statutes read. You want to use probation and community resources to supervise F4 and F5 offenders so you can ensure that you have enough prison space for felony level 1, 2s, and 3s, and most serious offenders should always be going to prison. But then you've added these other resources in the middle. And whether you have F1 through 3s going into these resources, which would be clearly a prison diversion, or if you're using these for F4s and F5s, clearly is not necessarily a prison diversion, is the big question we can't answer because the data doesn't exist currently and because there's no criteria to ensure that one or the other is happening most of the time. What we can do is when we chart admissions to each of these sanctions, in that same kind of format, we still see a huge number of people going to prison and into your most expensive community corrections resources, CBCFs and halfway houses, in the lowest felony levels. The levels that you want to reserve for your most serious offenders because they're the most expensive and intensive sanctions. All told, you're spending about $392 million on halfway house space, on CBCFs, and on prison space for the lowest level offenders in your system. They're committing the least serious felony crimes. Another way to look at it is to take CBCF admissions for 2008. Each of these black boxes represents 4 admissions to a CBCF in that year. And we're able to actually have good data on admissions to the community corrections programs. So we broke it out by felony level. About 27% of those going to CBCFs are felony 1 through 3s. Those are probably very clearly diversions from prison. right? Because the presumption is that F1 through 3 offenders will be going to prison. But 73% of admissions to CBCFs are F4, F5 offenders. Now, of course, some of these people have failed multiple times, and that's why they're going to a CBCF. So when we look at whether or not it's a violation of probation, and they would have likely been revoked to prison but for the CBCF being available, another good chunk of folks are taken out of the picture. That still leaves about 2,500 admissions a year. About 44% of CBCF admissions are people who were sentenced there as a condition of probation, meaning it was decided at sentencing, we believe, based on this data and our reading of it. This is going to be part of their sentence. Cost to state about $24 million. This is the population we're worried about. This is the population we don't know if they would have gone to prison if the CBCF resource didn't exist, or if they would just be placed on intensive probation or probation generally, like we see in other states. This third point about probation and the multitude of probation agencies. About 50,000 people in prison, we know. Another 40,000 are either on parole or post-release control or in a jail setting in one of the many county jails across the state of Ohio. But 74% of your criminal justice population is on probation. It's where most of the offenders are. And most of these are misdemeanor offenders. We think there's about 152,000 misdemeanor probationers supervised by municipal probation agencies. There's about 57 felony probationers. And then, according to Bureau of Justice Statistics, there's 50,000 unknown probationers. And during the editing process of the report, a frequent question was, what's an unknown probationer? The simple fact, according to the footnote in BJS, is whoever filled out the survey, because they send out 187 surveys to each of your probation agencies to try to figure out how many people are on probation, they didn't mark felony or misdemeanor, so we don't know. They could be on felony, they could be on misdemeanor. We don't know. But we do know this estimate of about 260,000 people on probation as of the end of 2008, when they last did their survey. 145 municipal probation agencies supervise the misdemeanor offenders of those. You invest about $11 million of state dollars in jail diversion programs that run in 80 counties across the state. There are then 41 county-level common pleas probation departments. You invest about $22 million at providing intensive probation and other services to divert people from prison onto probation. And then the state provides supervision services in 47 counties across the state, mostly your smaller and rural counties. As Dr. Fabella will go into more detail, each of these agencies has different policies, procedures, standards, and when we did a survey of probation officers, we found widely different contact standards, widely different risk assessments being used across the jurisdictions. So to sum up again, you've got this costly revolving door of your lowest level offenders coming into prison, coming back out with no supervision. Not much difference made in their lives as a result. You've got a bunch of alternatives, but there's no clear criteria that guides and makes sure that you're making the most cost-effective use of them. And then finally, underlying both of these issues is your probation system that is really the foundation for both how you deal with lowest level felony offenders, as well as what happens with your community corrections programs and how effective they are. In terms of where this all leads us in terms of a policy framework, obviously, as you heard this morning, we have three goals: to reduce recidivism, to reduce spending on corrections, and to reinvest some of those resources in what's more cost-effective strategies to reduce crime. So it's pretty clear some of the objectives we're going to have going forward. First, we're going to need to find strategies that strengthen probation and shift supervision resources towards the highest risk offenders in your system to have the biggest impact on crime. Second, we're going to need to refocus diversion and treatment resources to improve the cost effectiveness by developing a consensus about who goes where. And third, we need to identify opportunities to reinvest some of the savings and dollars in your system into more effective strategies that are going to reduce recidivism going forward. That's it in a nutshell. It's as concise as we can boil it down. But the devil's in the details, and we need to kind of dive into those details to better understand how to make sense of this information. There are three components to your front end of your criminal justice system that we want to now kind of tease apart in the presentations to come. First is your felony probation system, which we've already talked about. We need to look at and understand the challenges that that system faces. Second is your community corrections system. And then third is the behavioral health treatment resources that aren't being provided in prison or in your CBCFs or in your community corrections programs, but rather in community settings that people can access while they're on regular probation. Every single one of these three parts of the system are dependent on the other two. Your probation system cannot work unless you have CBCFs and halfway houses and community corrections programs to use as graduated sanctions in responding to violations of probation. A CBCF can't be effective providing treatment while someone's in the facility for 4 to 6 months if they return to probation supervision and there's no treatment in the community for them to return to. And treatment can't be effective unless there's an effective probation agent holding a person accountable for when they're not completing treatment or not showing up. So on each of these fronts, we're going to have one of the real experts in the room talk about. So Dr. Latessa will start talking about community corrections. We'll then have Dr. Fabello talk about probation. And this afternoon, we'll have Dr. Fred Osher talk about substance abuse and mental health treatment. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Ed Latessa.